Alright, I'm continuing from the last one. This is part two. I think I left off on the word protein. Crude protein is generally the term used. I don't know exactly what the definition of crude is in that word, but say a product says it's 26% crude protein, or just but again, I'm trying to stress a point here is that proteins are made up of amino acids, and they all have to be in a certain type of percentage here to make that protein effective towards the bird you're feeding. And if one is running short here or higher and out of balance with another one, that 26% is not going to be effectively 26% in the nutrition that you're feeding it. So you have a bird that requires 26%, but if its amino acids are out of balance, it's not receiving that or absorbing it. Like the way I got around some of that, like like I'm trying to say is that your commercially produced game bird feeds are for the commercial industry. That includes the bob white quail, the chuckers, and to some extent the Hungarians. But each generation down the road, and they're produced in so many sources of generation, they're almost becoming not domestic, but they're drifting away from your wildness and that. Also, many of the hobbyists out there that are on a smaller scale, or even some of the game things, will try to cut some costs and mix in the chicken feed to stretch it or something, or add more crushed corn or some other grains involved to reduce costs. I don't really blame them for doing it, but you're hammering the hell out of your protein. uh, but to completely duplicate wild protein that a bird does receive with the wild genetics that's living on its own is darn extremely difficult. Another thing I used to do is, since especially when you're feeding your breeder stock, you are feeding a more expensive den, and you're supposed to do it 1 month prior to the laying season. Well, of course, the hell, most of us don't do that, right? So she can build up her supplies. And another thing too is that your current pheasant, commercially produced pheasant, will lay upwards of 90 per season. If she's going to just drop her eggs, she's not going to go to nesting. If she's not chicken orientated as you may think, she's going to keep dropping eggs. And she may, if you got a pen that is like secluded and doing all that kind of thing, yeah, you may get that result. But if you want these eggs, 90 eggs compared to like 12 in the wild, takes a lot of protein sources, mineral sources, and things like that to just keep dropping these eggs. 90 eggs per season. You think about that for one hand. That's what I used to read, and I was getting close to that, but some of your books will say maybe 70, some say 60, but if you get into your far more domesticated birds like the jumbo pheasant, which you don't really find too much around like you used to, they're a big meat bird specifically bred for that, and they really have very little flight capability at all. And big bird. She'll even continue to lay even after rooster is out of season. You're gonna still probably getting some eggs. But anyways, get back to the point here. Is when I used to go through my trays, and I would candle them, to see who's fertile or not fertile, and you pull out all of your infertile ones. The eggs that were completely clear with no embryo development whatsoever, which I think is important, or maybe a slight, in it didn't take, and like have a little fuzzy area. Put them aside, and I would hard boil all of them. you know, put them in a separate freezers and stuff like that. Not freezers, but refrigerators. This is away from your human force. This is just part of what you do. And I would grind them up, shell and all, and even in the eggs that I used to eat, chicken eggs that are from the store and everything, save them shells and throw it in that, and grind it. And add that to the feed. In fact, is some of the chicks that were that I bred particularly for the wild, and just to get them started so there wouldn't be a loss here and there, I would take the egg yolk itself and after hard boiling them and push them through a sieve or a screen and make them into really small tiny particles and sprinkle that across their type of feed. And that'll get them going. And you can't beat that for a good protein source. But as I got into the birds, once they were transferred after 6 weeks, I mean, it was, feed consumption. Feed consumption. You got to remember, these birds are growing, and you got to make it all available to them. And since I live not far from the lakes, the Great Lakes of Michigan here, Lake St. Clair, and there was a season that fish fly season, and these things were considered a nuisance, smelly, and were attracted inland by the bright lights. Especially if you're over there on Jefferson or something, and there's a gas station there, or a 7-Eleven or something, and they got these lights on. Oh, place is going to be fish flies everywhere. And you can't even walk on these things without them snapping in your feet and everything, and that, but and hey, I used to go over there and I said, hey, you want these? Get rid of them, get rid of them. I used to go over there with a broom, sweep them into big piles, throw them in the buckets, take them back, throw them in the buckets, and then, most of it was dead and everything while they were totally fresh. And I'd take big sheets of plywood and lay them out in the yard and everything, and pour them out on there, spread them out, let the sun dry them, good. And then bring them up, try to find a way to save them, and I would have a freezer. They used to use my deer meat in and stuff like that. I'm not into deer hunting, and put them in there. Man, you cannot believe what a source of protein that was. I mean, I would take, let's say for an example, I'd have a handful of live ones or something, and I had the pheasants in a smaller box or something. I'd throw them in there. They just go freaking ass crazy and eat every one of them. They just go like bandits, Never wanted to overdo anything in any particular area, okay? It was a matter of pacing yourself. But well, I would have these things. I would have the fish flies that are relatively dried out and stuff like that, and I would throw them in there from time to time when I was readjusting to the field, and they just went bonkers, man. I mean, you can't. And we'll get past it. I mean, it sounds messy and everything, but it had its benefits. Even when I was raising some other ducks and stuff like that, wow, and the growth rate and the reduction of cannibalism was fantastic. It was a kind of a substitute, but what I'm trying to get at the point here is that when these wild birds, the pheasants in the field, they're out there in the fields going after these grasshoppers and these crickets and this, and you cannot be going out there and doing spraying and to reduce your stuff. And I know it becomes somewhat to a degree necessary, so we have our crop harvested. But you see an incompatibility here. You want pheasants, and you've got to have the chicks in the wild. Otherwise, you're going to have to resort constantly and continually do it on a commercial basis, which is expensive and labor intensive also. And you're only going to do it for a short time, and it's going to be a repetitive time, a continuous time, and you're going to still, whatever you do over a long period of time, what you're breeding in captivity is not going to have the same genetic quality because you have genetic drift towards. There is no selective natural selection taking place. It's the selection that what survives in captivity, and nothing is being weeded out as it would be in the wild naturally. You see? So if you want to do it that way, the genetic drift is going to take over. The birds are going to be slightly less always with each generation. Well, 5, 10 generations, and then what you have left here, there's just no way you're going to actually be able to reverse that part of the genetic part. No matter what you feed, no matter what you do, is because it's no longer there, and that bird cannot be reintroduced to the wild to an extent where it will survive. And if it is possible, and you do it, you're going to have to do it in such great numbers to allow natural selection to kick back in to, and it's going to be feeding on all this other stuff, and maybe there's 1, 3, 5 here that do survive and do go produce, and then you're selecting back to the wild, but it can't be artificially done. But the environment has to be available. You have to have a bird, like, skip what I just said, let's go back to what we have now. If you're going to reintroduce wild genetics back into the wild, which we're still capable of doing, the habitat has to be available. There has to be plenty of bugs, plenty of wild protein, plenty of natural sources for these birds for their entire life cycle. You just can't go out there, commercially raise a bunch of birds in captivity, turn them all out there, and hunt away at them, bang, 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 and wow, I got 50 birds today, or this guy, or they bring in all their trophy stuff, they drive in with their trucks and their RVs, and they're showing these loads of things. Well, they were all released birds that were raised under the other conditions. But if you want that type of harvest, a natural wild harvest, you have to have all of these other things going on, taking place in the wild, and that means don't be spraying your crops. Make sure if you've got to have marginal habitat, which is fine, you've got to have an entire habitat for this bird that exists in all ranges of its life. It's not just the final hunting season when you can walk into a cornfield and these adult birds are there and you're taking them out, fine. And one thing wonderful about the pheasant, in the wild generally, when there's no hunting going on and they're sustaining themselves on their own, there's 50% hens, 50% roosters. So the roosters compete to get as many hens as they can. You will see a major dominant or rooster mate with 3, 4, possibly up to 6 hens. He's the guy. He's the one, for some reason, has the right genetics, has the right stuff, and is passing on his genes. But under most conditions, there's going to be those extra roosters. Okay, if he's got 6,